Senator Jones, welcome back to Judiciary Non-Civil. Last good Title 16 bill I passed was on the back of one of your bills. I appreciate you coming back. We're going to take up a couple things today. I know that Senator Albert's bill's a little bit more detailed, so we're going to take you second in the batting order, if that's okay, Senator. We're going to have a hearing today. We're not going to move on things. One of the reasons we wanted to get you right out of the gate was to get the issues on the table early. If there's anything that comes up, we want to make sure you have plenty of time. These 12 legislative days seem to last a long time until the very end, and then they end quickly. So make sure we have time. So with that, I'd like to recognize you for Senate Bill 78. We're looking at LC version 412977S. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So this is what we call image sexual abuse. So it's expanding current law. So current law basically says that if you were to post something of the sexually explicit nature of someone against their consent, and the purpose being for harassment or financial gain, it's a high and aggravated misdemeanor. So that's current law right now today. So what this does is expands the penalty if something happens a little bit different, and that is if you actually transmit it to an adult website, a pornography website. If you transmit it there, then it would actually be a felony. So what we're doing is saying, I guess to some extent, there's a normal revenge porn, for lack of a better term. But then if you actually increase that and put it on an adult website, it would actually become a felony. So what brings us here? And one, when you're talking about, let's look at it from a general standpoint. When you talk about from an adult website situation, adult websites have 120 million hits per day, 3.5 billion a year. There's only 7-8 billion people live in the world. So just from that standpoint, the potentiality of harm is greater. But what actually kind of brings us here, over the last year, there have been major stories that have taken place in the media that has brought attention to this new form of revenge porn. New York Times did a cover story in December called The Children of Pornhub, which deals with kids being put onto adult websites, rapes being put onto adult websites, and then also your quote unquote traditional revenge porn on adult websites. The Guardian did a story commenting in June because an adult website was doing a fundraiser or some basically some charity for coronavirus. And the Guardian did a cover story saying that they should forget the coronavirus and focus on this real pandemic, which is revenge porn. There have been other major publications that have dealt with this. It has caused Congress, through Senator Josh Hawley and a few other Democratic legislators too, to actually try to pass legislation to allow lawsuits against adult websites that allow revenge porn. Just over the last 6 months, MasterCard and Visa have decided their products can no longer be used on 2 major adult websites because of revenge porn. This stuff, these restrictions have never taken place before. It is because of the lights that this has taken place. One major pornography website now requires what they call verification. When they made that requirement, meaning that you had to verify that this was consensual, when they made that requirement, because of the lack of verification, they had 14 million videos. They had to lose 9 million videos because they could not be verified. The human cost of this is that it affects mostly women. 90% of revenge porn victims are women. In some of these articles that you read, you find where many of them, one, for instance, she was placed on a major site, received over 400 text messages, none of the persons that she knew, calling her a whore, asking her to kill herself, which she actually attempted to do twice by hanging herself. Another young lady had over 600,000 hits on Pornhub, and her ex-boyfriend had actually monetized the site. It's also very difficult to get these materials down once they go up. There are some sites which actually specifically target quote unquote revenge porn, such as myx.com, which has recently been taken down, and another called Is Anyone Up? But you don't even need those when you have what they call these tube sites, which persons can just freely post at any time. So this is a crime. It's not, and I've been using the term revenge porn, but actually to take it back. In reality, the actual term should be image sexual abuse or something like that nature. As one commentator said, we don't talk about revenge muggings or revenge batteries or revenge murders. It basically is an assault against, and as I said, most are women. It is against a person. It's not revenge for anything. Revenge usually means you're retaliating against a wrong that was done to you. In this sense, the only quote unquote wrong was you no longer like anybody. And porn gives an idea of consent, and nothing is consensual about this. So what we're doing is we're saying, okay, there's a normal image sexual abuse. You send it to your friends, you post it on your Facebook. That's bad. That's high and aggravated. But once you take it up and put it onto an adult website, what you're attempting to do is actually literally destroy the person. And so therefore it works sort of like if you have under an ounce of marijuana, but you have an ounce, it's a felony. Same conduct, same event, but we look at your state of mind. If you have a theft over $1,500 and $1 goes to a felony. If you steal government property, it goes to the felony. So it's the same conduct, but we're looking at your state of mind and the impact that it has. And when a person does this, it's not by accident, especially now, because there's a little bit more restrictions on a lot of these sites. You have to go through a verification process. You still have to fill out basically a few questions before you can upload. So if you're doing this now, this is not a crime of passion. It's not just being mad at somebody. You fully are aware of what you're trying to do, which is literally try to destroy this human being by placing these materials on an adult website. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'll take any questions.
What questions do we have from members of the committee? Chair recognizes Chairman Burchett for a question.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
I circled a little line 31, and this is, I think, tracking some of the language that when we added these two subparagraphs in here, serves no legitimate purpose to the depicted person. So you mentioned in the example of the revenge porn, the boyfriend monetized the video, right?
That's correct.
If it was monetized and half of that money was going to the girlfriend, would that seem to be, it would be a offense? Go ahead.
Well, at that point in time, it wouldn't be, it would be consensual. I mean, if we're assuming that she's accepting the money, it would actually be consensual. She would be part of it. So I think in that sense, she wouldn't fit under this particular statute. A person can freely post whatever they want. And in fact, the way it actually works is most of these image sexual abuse pictures, they go up as leaked sex tapes. That's how they're labeled, to give it the impression that they're actually consensual. But yeah, she was consenting and she was receiving the money. She wouldn't even fit within the statute.
So if she was, let's just say she wasn't consenting, and I was arguing as an attorney for the defense here, and I'm saying, well, Your Honor, this was posted and the money was, sent to this proposed victim's PayPal account or Venmo account. Seems that you could get around this, is essentially what I'm saying by doing that.
Right,
because it's a legitimate purpose.
Yeah, well, you also have this posted for harassment. So she would have to say, yeah, I received money for it, because she's the one who's going to bring it to the attention of the police. And of course, just like in any other case, they'll have to make that determination. But, it's for a person's harassment, financial loss, or serves no legitimate purpose to the depicted person. So she's the one who most likely she is the one who's going to be bringing the complaint.
Mm-hmm.
So she's going to be alleging, and of course, this tracking current law. She's the one that's going to be saying, this is what it's doing to me. And obviously, if she's receiving money, that's what the law enforcement have to deal with.
Right. Okay. Well, I was wondering, did with any of this this language before we're adding these two subsections, has that ever been an issue? Do you know?
I have not known of it actually being an issue, because I think that the fact that you have the aspect of harassment or causing financial, you have different things there, which I think would cover it. But I have not heard from any prosecutor or whatnot that it has caused an issue.
Okay. Thank you, Senator.
Mm-hmm.
Chair recognizes Representative McLaurin for a question.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks for bringing the bill, Senator. I've been publicly a little upset recently in the House, on the House side, with making new felonies. I know I made a bit of a show about the porch piracy bill and how, you could take a $20 package off somebody's porch, and now Georgia law would consider that a felony. But isn't
For the
it?
record, it was not a show. It was quite sincere, I believe. Correct?
Well, right. I'm describing how other people experienced it, Mr.
Okay.
Chair. But isn't it true that this type of conduct and what I think the word you used was destroy, that when you take an image or a depiction of somebody so in such a vulnerable state and you make it so public for the purpose of, creating a lasting, a perpetual emotional injury to this person that really technologically we have no way to erase
That's
from
correct.
the internet, that this really does fall into that serious category of conduct where Georgia law deserves to make a distinction.
Absolutely. And my record has shown that I'm also against new felons, trying to, lower the penalty of marijuana. For the last 5 years, I've done that bill to try to lower the penalty of marijuana and things of that nature. And I wrestled with this, but I said, no, when you're doing this is what you're trying to do. This isn't just, I'm mad at you. When you send it to your friends, it's going to come down. It can be distributed, but when you have an opportunity to send it on the porn site, millions of people literally can see this, and she'll never know where to go. You send it to your friend, she kind of knows where to go and kind of grab it down and things of that nature. She'll never know where to go. One of the ladies said she's afraid to leave her house. She's afraid to even do an application for a job because she had 400,000 hits. And that's going to happen.
And I appreciate you saying that. And having worked with a client before in my law practice capacity who has suffered from a type of harm like this, it is much more comprehensive in terms of the pervasiveness of the emotional harm than I think some people could even imagine. So I appreciate you bringing the bill, and thanks for clarifying.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Chairman Burchett.
One more.
Yes.
Also, could you elaborate on what it means to include a falsely created videographic or still image?
Yeah, that's your deep fakes that you can actually get on. You could Google that right now on your phone. You can put your face onto another body if you wanted to, and so that's what they call deep fakes. So you could put your face on anybody out there. And so what you also can do is put other person's faces on images. So you could have a porn site, you could have the regular porn star, so to speak, and then you could take your girlfriend's face and put it on her, put that on there. And that's what they call a deep fake.
And from the perspective legally, if it's not an image as such, then for years there was this contention that it wasn't an actual representation of that person because it was a deep fake. Wasn't an image of you. It
Right.
just sort of looks like you. So is that really an image and likeness of you? So for a couple of years, they're able to sort of slip past criminal accountability by following that theory.
Thank you.
Okay. I've got Representative Smith has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry I can't be there with y'all in person. I had to come back home and got to handle a case this evening. Senator, I appreciate you bringing this bill. And I just want to point out, it's kind of interesting to me how, we're picking and choosing which new violations we want to create. It seems like just the other day, Representative B brought a new code violation, and we didn't really jump up and down about that. So, I just want to see a little bit of uniformity here. I mean, we all try to be bipartisan in this committee, but seems like we had pretty bipartisan support the other day in the House on creating a new felony violation. So, to pick and choose which ones you want to, be upset about, that's kind of disingenuous in my opinion. But Senator, I appreciate you bringing this bill and look forward to working on it.
Thank you.
Representative Smith, let me say this. I mean, what's your question? I don't know that what you shared was terribly helpful. What's your substantive question about the bill?
I would say this. My question is, how many cases are we seeing these type of situations come through and they're falling through the cracks? I mean, it seems like to me there's a need for this bill, and so that's really what I want to know is, I mean, are we seeing cases fall through the cracks because we don't have the necessary laws on the books to prosecute this with such a deterrent effect that we would prohibit this type of conduct?
Well, again, let me just pause there and say the gentleman, I don't think, is trying to create a new circumstance that's not currently covered in law. I think he's trying to increase the penalties to possibly 10-year felony as opposed to 5-year felony if it meets the criteria that's bracketed on lines 27 through 30 and 34 through 37. And that is, if it's not just posted or transmitted, but it's posted to a commercial website that advertises, promotes the services showing, proving, or distributing sexually explicit content. So there's these websites that I think the gentleman's tried to define here. And if you put this, you transmit it into that stream, if you can demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that this new element's satisfied, then it's not a 1 to 5 felony, it's a 1 to 10 felony. So I think that's the gentleman's purpose here. As I read the bill, it's a new element that's got to be demonstrated. But I think his point has nothing to do with any partisan question. It has to do simply with the question, if we can satisfy this additional element, should you be limited with a 5-year felony, or should you be able to step it up to a 10-year felony because of the impact it has on people?
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I appreciate your reference, because this is a bipartisan committee, and when it breaks otherwise, I've admonished members of our subcommittee this year for going there, because that's not where we live. So I appreciate that sensitivity. I would ask the senator, you had alluded to a high and aggravated misdemeanor.
Mm-hmm. Yes, your first lifetime is actually a high and aggravated misdemeanor. C1, line 44 and 45. So it actually is the first lifetime is a high and aggravated misdemeanor. So that's your first lifetime with your normal revenge porn, so to speak. So this here with your first lifetime, if we can meet those elements, would be a felony, because somebody doing it 2 times, that first lifetime to the victim is enough under these circumstances.
I'm sorry, I stumbled over that.
Sure, I understand.
So first time high and aggravated, second time is 1 to 5 felony. This,
right.
If you demonstrate this additional element, it's 1 to 10 out the gate.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay. How comfortable are you that the additional elements you're adding defines all the criteria and can be proven up adequately? I mean, is this, have you taken this from any other statute, or is this something where do we need to delve into this element to make sure the language is exactly as it needs to be, or do you feel pretty comfortable about?
I do feel comfortable. This actually would be one of the statutes of first impression. Some states do felonies, 9 states that do felonies, but what they do is they don't differentiate. And I think this is actually a balance. I think there is one level, but there's another level. And I think by saying if you can show it, and to me, it's kind of actually restrictive, because it has to be a commercial website that's basically an adult entertainment website. So I'm actually trying to narrow it down to what we're going to be punishing as a felony, because felony treatment is very serious. But if we can show that, then it ought to be a felony.
Okay. And this, in essence, it makes the existing paragraph 1 and 2 a lesser included, perhaps, if you couldn't prove that up.
Right. Absolutely.
How does to my question, how does the way second or subsequent works in 1611, chapter 16, chapter 11, has there been discussion about if you do more than one of these things, those sort of merging into one, or is there I would envision these things often happening more than once.
Yes.
You post one to one website and another to another website. Does taking 4 pictures of a former so-called girlfriend and posting one to one website and another to another commercial website, is that your high and aggravated and this is your 1 to 5 felony? Or is there a mechanism here that requires these to be, to get to the 1 to 5 felony, these to be prosecuted in separate packages of charges, as it were?
Correct. I would have to look at that. That's a great question, because you are going to probably have, he's not going to stop at one, he's going to do multiple. And is that just going to be one offense? So I'll check into that. I think the statute actually says something in other areas about like only counts for one offense, but I'm going to check into that and see if we need to change that language or whatnot.
This bill doesn't change that. That's
right.
It's going to fall into our conventional criminal procedure.
That's correct.
I wanted to know if that had been discussed.
It had not.
And if you want to address that while we're in this code section. Chair recognizes Chairman Burchett.
Senator, how does it work to cause the electronic transmission? If we're having a conversation beforehand and talking about this piece of legislation, if there is something populated to the cloud and it's hacked, and then it ends up on one of these sites, is that the cause that you're after, or would that be reached under your legislation here?
I think that is where, because of course this is also repeating current law. So what I'm thinking is that if I send it, I've electronically transmitted it. But then if someone else was to grab, and that was my intent. So let's say under this new statute, I'm sending it to an adult website, and then persons grab it, which they perfectly can, and they send it out. Then it was my action which caused it for further dissemination, is the way I believe this is basically. So let's look at it under the current law. I send it to my friend, and then he sends it out. That would be current law. So I would be the cause of him actually sending it out, that initial thing. Because instead of saying, well, I didn't electronically transmit it to Bob, my friend sent it to Bob. Yeah, but if you wouldn't have sent out that first thing, it never would have went to him.
All right, so I understand a little better there now, but in the instance that you don't, same scenario, it's your laptop is hacked or your cloud is hacked, and then this stuff ends up on one of these sites. How do we prevent a non-intentional
Right.
causation type scenario from being prosecuted here?
Right. This is actually right. It's an intentional crime. So it would have to show intent.
Where's
So-
where's the intent element in here?
If a person violates this code section, if he or she, page 113, line 13. Person violates this code section if he or she, knowing the content of a transmission or post, knowingly and without the consent of the depicted person, does these things. So in that sense, I have it as long as it was consensual. It may be another element if I'm secretly taping somebody, but if I have it and we both in consent and I get hacked, I'm not going to be in violation of this. I did not send that out. I did not knowingly send anything.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
And again, to the author, I think the fact that it's, you've got knowingly and without consent or elements, you got to prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yes.
And that, I think that's a pretty safe structure you got there. My question to you is going to be this. Let's explore this on the practical side. And I don't have any, I'm not prejudging this. I just, one thing I'm sensitive to when we do these things, and I've said before, I tend to be on serious offenses. I tend to be a 1 to 30 guy. Sometimes things are 1 year, 2 year, 3 years. Sometimes they're 25, depending on the fact pattern. I am sensitive to things like this where they are, 1 to 10 felony for this. I just want to step back and ask ourselves,
Sure.
as the gatekeepers of this, the idea of the equal application of justice across 49 judicial circuits in the state. My concern is, are you comfortable if somebody takes this information? And again, for those who are looking, I'm not online, I'm not being callous to this issue. I'm just saying, let's the heft of what we're talking about here, not to minimize it. Are you comfortable with someone getting 5, 6 years to serve, say they're sentenced to 10, or they're sentenced for a couple counts of this to serve 8 years, hard time to actual serve in prison for posting content?
Correct.
Are you comfortable with? I know in our system so often it doesn't really work that way. It's adjudicated
Correct.
this way, and they go on probation. It's first offense, and that's the case in some circuits.
That's correct.
Other circuits it don't work that way, particularly if it's not a sympathetic circumstance. Are you comfortable with people spending 5 to 10 years hard time in prison for posting content?
I've wrestled with it, and I can't say necessarily, Mr. Chair, that I'm still not. It is kind of stiff. So it's not anything that I'm opposed to try to change and think through it. I mean, it is without a doubt, and to some extent, someone asked me about that, and I said, well, they're not going to probably go to jail, but I'm thinking about it from the standpoint of my circuit. Some circuits, they very well may get 10 years. So it is something I'm still kind of, and since we're at a hearing only, I am still wrestling with it, but I do want to make sure, I definitely want to make sure it was a felony, and I also wanted to make sure we had a range that would deter. And I think that was the key, a range that would deter.
Because again, and I asked the question, I mean, I think, we think about there are ways that very sympathetic judges can adjudicate 1 to 10 felonies, 1 to 5 felonies, sent one, and it's treated as a misdemeanor, that they have that diversion off ramp that our Representative Bodie educated me on about 6 years ago. So there are cases, there are ways I was not aware of that until about 6 or 7 years ago, that if you're in the 1 to 10 range or less, it can be adjudicated as misdemeanor under certain circumstances in courts and so forth. So there are some off ramps. We've got opportunities for for first offender and some of those things. So those exist. But I've also had people get armed robbery, 10-year sentences, 4 to serve for handing a note for an opioid addict, for handing a note to 2 different pharmacists saying, I have a gun, I want some Oxycontin. And they 4 to serve, hard time. I mean, that actually happens. Right. So I'm just sensitive to this.
I understand.
I mean, I think the existing statute contemplates a 1 to 5 for a second. Do you really want 1 to 10?
For first, right.
Just think about it. I mean, I'm not trying to prejudge it. I do think, as you know, that the felony track and the misdemeanor track are different tracks. They're handled differently. And I think sometimes we can be so conditioned by the way, quote, lower level felonies even in certain circuits are treated that we can even become desensitized to. That's not the case across this very large state.
Right.
And I want to make sure we understand that, because I do believe we have an interest recognizing the diversity of how things are treated as the lawmaking body. And this room candidly is where the lawmaking body on the 3rd floor really depends on us working out these details. Yes. That we get get the 1 to 10, 1 to whatever, 1 to 5, whatever we said, get that right.
I'll definitely take a look at it. I'll check with other states and I'll look at on our statutes too. And I'll have that for you when I come back.
Okay. Any further questions from members of the committee? Hearing none. Senator, do you have anyone else who wants to speak on this today?
No.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you, do we have anybody online that's Maisie Ms. Causey from Georgia Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers? Ms. Causey, welcome.
Thank you. We are going to stand down on this bill, Chairman. Thank you for offering, though.
When you say stand down, what do you mean?
We don't have any comment about this bill.
Okay. Thanks, Ms. Causey. Appreciate it. Senator, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
We are going to try to get action on this. I don't want to push this to the deadline.
Absolutely.
But if you got members of the committee that you want to get talk to about this, from my vantage point, I think the elements are here. I do think there's a higher level of, you get this extra element to prove. Double check the language. This is the time to get this right.
That's correct.
If something moves early enough, there's not going to be an issue if we have to make a change to get an agree on your end. So let's be thoughtful about the sentencing side. And let's we'll have you back for subcommittee next time.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Appreciate your time.
All right.
Senator Albers, welcome back to our humble committee.
Good to see you, Mr. Chairman. How's everybody doing today?
Well,
All survived crossover day.
that's right.
All right. At a future meeting, either with your subcommittee or the full committee, I would like to bring the Groover family in with this bill. It's named after their son, Max. I know we had a little short timing because we're trying to catch up from crossover day,
Sure.
but just ask the committee's discretion on that. I'll give a brief.
And again, Senator, I do want you to give a overview of the bill. I'd like members of the subcommittee, if we could, to kind of highlight some issue areas. Our members have not had perhaps the time to study this and the rigor that they might have otherwise. We announced the subcommittee meeting this morning, but having looked through it, and I do want the subcommittee members to highlight to you questions they might have, sort of issue areas that we might be able to explore more deeply next time.
Certainly.
You've got the
Thank you,
floor.
Mr. Chairman. This bill is very personal to my community, and it is named in the memory of Max Groover. His parents, Steve and Rayanne, lost their son, Max, at a hazing incident in 2017 at Louisiana State University. But unfortunately, it is not a unique issue that has happened over the years in our colleges and universities. And this happens in clubs. It happens in intramurals. It happens certainly in the sorority fraternity. And I'll begin by saying that I myself am a fraternity man, and both of my sons are. So this is not an indictment to a fraternity or sorority, or I was also a member of the Cardinal Marching Band. However, it is a opportunity for us to shine a light and improve this process in order to make sure we're saving our young people. Max's parent, Stephen Rand, who I mentioned earlier, testified in our Senate committee, and I know they want to come here to tell their story. They've dedicated their lives to the Max Gruber Foundation. They go all over the country and talk to colleges and universities. Just to give you an idea of how real-time this is, just a couple of days ago, a young man in Bowling Green State University lost his life in a hazing incident. Just about 3 weeks ago, I received a call from a friend of mine in Roswell, and his son, who goes to a university right here in Georgia, was a part of a pledge class. They were walking to a bathroom, 7 of them told to drink 100 beers before they came out. 100 beers, 7 kids. That would have been alcohol poisoning for all 7 of them, and likely something much worse. So this, unfortunately, is something that happens even today. This bill, again, is not an indictment on those groups, but an opportunity to shed a light on it. Since it's been recorded, there's been over 200 young women and men who have lost their lives. There's also been thousands of incidents that has been intentional bodily harm, some of those in the most critical nature. Some of that bodily harm is due to drinking, drugs, extreme actions in organized groups. I'd like to bring you through this bill just as a highlight of the sections to tell you what we're trying to do to remedy this. The first part of the bill is to define what hazing is. And we have worked very closely. I want to thank our colleges and universities, have worked with pretty much every stakeholder group, meeting with them, making tweaks to this language. And it establishes higher penalties if they force people into situations that cause severe bodily harm or death. And it raises that to a felony and a fine up to $50,000. It also creates a misdemeanor criminal penalty for failing to render reasonable assistance. However, at the same time, it offers protection to those who act in good faith and in a timely manner in order to prevent and report these crimes. You might remember we did something very similar to this with folks who would be afraid to call the police or EMS for somebody who's in an opioid overdose, right? So this is the very same premise and actually some of the very same language we used. Third part is to provide for our Attorney General of the state to bring civil action against organizations related to hazing in order to promote governance and oversight from alumni boards and national organizations. Let me talk about that for a moment. I was a proud member of Sigma Phi Epsilon for my undergrad, and then later on, for many years, I was part of the alumni board. Now, both the alumni board there, as well as the many non-for-profits I sit on today and several corporate boards I sit on, I take that responsibility very seriously. I'm not just there to say yay. I'm there to ask those hard questions to make sure I'm providing governance and oversight. Unfortunately, a lot of these organizations, alumni boards, have made that just a social event, not taken those responsibilities seriously, and they need to be held accountable for the oversight they need to provide. So we figure the best way to do that is to let them know that they themselves are accountable. And we've found the best way you should do that is to threaten their wallet. And lastly, I call this the truth in advertising part of the bill. This has our colleges and universities provide a public report of hazing violations to show the transparency. An example would be is my younger son is in college right now in his first year. Prior to joining a club, intramural sport, fraternity, sorority, to show that that information is available so we together as student and parents can make good decisions. The reason you might be saying, well, gosh, John, why would we do that? It's because a lot of that stuff was swept under the rug. They didn't want the bad press or PR, whether it be for the organization or even in some cases, the university. So that's to make sure we have transparency. Now, I do want to point out that this specifically excludes NCAA sports because they have their own governance structure, as well as ROTC, Corps of Cadets, and other military organizations because they are covered under the Department of Defense. Now, this is truly a bipartisan bill. It passed last year and this year unanimously in the Senate. Unfortunately, it passed right before COVID hit last year, so we were able to push it forward. And we did add something through a great new freshman senator from our body, Senator Kim Jackson, who very astutely had us update in line 72 and 77 of this bill that it would be any person 17 years of older to make sure we are consistent. We didn't have a 15-year-old or a 14-year-old involved. That just would not necessarily apply to them. Again, to keep consistency in our law. I also want to thank the governor's office, lieutenant governor's office, and all the colleagues that helped me do this. I mentioned earlier just some of the groups that have helped out in this, the Georgia Trial Lawyers Association, the prosecuting attorneys, colleges and university systems, as well as all the folks on the subcommittee and committees of the Senate Judiciary bodies, and certainly the Gruber family. So with that, I wanted to give you a brief but hopefully reasonably comprehensive high-level view, Mr. Chairman, and it would certainly yield further questions you may have.
Well, Senator, and for those who are listening, I've got, I'm looking at Senate Bill 85 CSFA. I don't know the underlying LC that this was before it was labeled that way.
I can tell you if you'd like.
If you could, please.
Yes, it was LC 412995S.
Okay.
And the changes between that were made on the floor, again on line 72 and again on line 77, just simply adding any person who's 17 years or older. That was the only changes.
Okay. We're going to want to walk through probably in some great detail. Is today the day you want to do that, or would you rather do that in a subsequent subcommittee hearing?
Prerogative of the chairman.
Okay. Let me ask if there's any general questions, and then we'll start walking through that if we could. Chair recognizes Chairman Burchett for a question.
Thank you, Senator, for bringing this measure. I had a question actually to what you had mentioned about the change. So on 72 and 77, you've said that 17 years or older, but you define minor as 18 years or younger. Did you intentionally do that, or do we want to? It seems there's a little bit of
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to go which way you want
Which
to go.
line was that for the
40,
minor?
line 40 is minor, means any person under the age of 18.
To the gentleman's question, I think it's a matter of before 18th birthday or after 17th birthday. Is that your intention?
Yes, that would be my intention.
And
Correct.
did you intend to craft it that way, I guess, is the gentleman's question.
The answer was in the original creation of the bill and creating of the definitions. That was our original intent. And then when Senator Jackson brought her amendment to the floor, it was making sure that we didn't inadvertently, take someone who is younger than that and then put him into an area of the criminal code that would be inappropriate. But you bring up a very valid point. It was a change on the floor.
So do we want to leave it? Do we want to put
So-
18 in both lines, or do we want to put 17 in both lines?
Well, my thought process would be to 17 and older, just to keep it consistent with everything else in the code. But that's a really good catch, certainly. So in this case, we would just say any person who is 17 years or older, just to make it the same.
So all right, we'll dive into that a little bit more. While I have you though, I wanted to ask one more question, and I'd like the chair. I do want to dig in quite a bit. I played college football, and this one clause in here, D, lines 32 through 35. You could probably say that my coaches were hazing me at some point because of the calisthenics that I had to continually endure in 90, 100 degree weather. So this section here is fairly broad in that limited to sleep deprivation, exposure to elements, confinement in small spaces, or calisthenics that subject. And I think what you wanted there, it says the other person, but what you wanted there may have been the minor or the student to an unreasonable risk of harm. That, can you explain to me what we're trying to capture there?
Certainly. Just a clarifying question. If you played in college, likely you were paying for NCAA sports, right?
Yes.
Okay, so that they are specifically excluded because NCAA sports are governed under their own infrastructure, and the same with any ROTC, Corps Cadets, et cetera, because they are governed under the Department of Defense. So they are excluded from this bill.
Okay.
Yep.
So thank you for clarifying that. And that's another question I had. So in this scenario here, what can you give me maybe a fact pattern that would fall within that D section that you think would fall within perform or endure physical activity that maybe unreasonable risk of harm?
So you're looking for a specific example?
I mean, just any
Sure.
fact pattern. I'm trying to figure what we're trying to get at there.
Right. So one of the examples I was shared, I had a couple of students come visit me last year prior to the pandemic beginning, and they asked to remain anonymous. They go to one of our larger universities here, and they wanted to be anonymous, but they wanted to tell me individually of both of them, both sororities and fraternities. And candidly, sometimes the gals are much rougher than the guys are. What was happening in one of these cases, they would take someone and they had in one of the houses, a part of the floor they'd open up, and they'd have that person have to be in their underwear, and they'd put them down there in under the floor onto the dirt, and basically would physically lock them away in the middle of the winter for 12 hours with a small blanket, right? Literally freezing in the elements, right, to that. In another case, someone was, they were made to be put on top of a house in the middle of the 100-degree sun, and to stay up there in a bathing suit, right, with no protections from the sun for 12 hours from sun up to sundown, right? So things of that nature. Other cases are, having folks, do all sorts of things that you can imagine the young folks can come up with when they have too much time on their hands.
Okay. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Representative McLaurin.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks for your overview of the bill, Senator. Can see why it passed unanimously. I mean, I think this is good public policy in the main. Are you referring to lines 113 to 116 when you're talking about the exclusion for physical activity? I just want to make sure I understand which language you
Correct.
believe is
So
doing that. Okay.
There is a specific area that goes to NCAA sports and the Department of Defense. But this is
Okay.
just in regular. So as an example would be a regular intramural sport, right? So when I was in college, I wasn't good enough to play on the big team. But I'd like to play, softball and flag football and those kind of things.
Sure. Okay. Can you point me to the exclusion that has the effect you're talking about that's specifically for those programs?
Yes. Let me just get to that.
Because I would read 113 to 116 to accomplish it, but that's why because it says any, athletic program that's sanctioned by the institution. So
Just have to find it real quick here.
it's no worries. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
That's okay. I had a highlighted copy in my office, and it is still, in fact, sitting in my office highlighted. So I'm just looking through a fresh version right now. So
Sure, that's fine, and we can come back to it. That was just going to the conversation earlier. I was just wondering.
And Representative McLaurin, I'm not going to stop you there. I'm not going to take it from you. I'm going to let you continue your question. I would ask while we're there, though, as I look at this language, and again, we're exploring the sort of the boundaries of this physical activity for a person's physical training, participating in a physical education event, athletic event, or similar program, pretty broad, sanctioned by the post-secondary educational institutions. I don't see anywhere that it's sanctioned by a national institution. If the, a fraternity intramural sports event. I mean, it was my freshman, much of my college athletic experience was my freshman hall playing against fraternities in intramural soccer and sports, right? I like you, was not able to get on the big field. But you think about that, you think about a sanctioned intramural event. that through which an organization, be it a fraternity, be it someone else, fraternity, sorority, or some other organization, was able to sort of channel this, hey, we're training for fraternity sports now. You know, our fraternity's on the line, our honors on the line. So we're going to, through this, kind of pursue this course of training, which rises to what would otherwise be hazing. I don't know that 113, 116 is limited to Chairman Burchett's NCAA experience. I think it might extend to provide almost a safe harbor that you don't intend for intramural sports through which hazing and those kind of things can happen. So I mean, while we're talking about it, I'm not convinced the 113 to 116 might not need to be tightened up a little bit more,
Okay.
To make sure there's not an unintentional consequence. But with that,
That makes sense to me, Mr. Chair. And okay, so I guess a couple, since your intention, Mr. Chair, is to go through the bill at some point, and this is more just high level stuff for now.
What I'd like to do this time I'd like to go to every detail you see.
Okay.
Now, I'd like to raise it to the author so he's got time to work on these things, work with you.
Sure.
When we have members of the public here that are the nature of that is less sort of around the table. It's a little bit more of a public event than this.
Sure. I'm happy to go in order of the things I've noticed.
Take the deep dive if you could.
Sure. Line 25. The hazing definition right above it is broad enough, it seems like, to capture quite a lot of probability and causality, right? It means to force or subject to perform, which endangers or is likely to endanger, or is likely to cause the minor or student to. So likely to cause, right? Which means you don't even necessarily have to intend specifically that a minor or student go out and violate state law. It could just be what a jury considers the natural byproduct of an action, right? Likely to cause. So given that that's that broad, my question about line 25 is, do you want to encompass all violations of federal and state law? I mean, I went to UGA for undergrad, and on any given night, there are unfortunately a lot of people under the age of 21 who are violating several misdemeanor statutes, and that's just a fact of life. And we have laws in place for that, but this is targeting actions by somebody that could cause somebody else to be likely to violate any misdemeanor. Now, granted, it says force or subject, but subject could be kind of broad. So if you are organizing a night out and you say a group of us want to go to Blue Sky, I'm using actual proper nouns from Athens, Georgia, and one of the members of the group is 19 or 20, that could be hazing, right? Because you're subjecting a member of the group through any sort of social pressure to either do underage drinking or anything like that. So to me, any violation of federal and state law writ large is a little broad for me. And I would want to see if, and who knows if we can, find a way to narrow that to just those violations of law that we're most concerned about. And I mean, if we want to put in an element like violate federal or state law, that, whose purpose is to protect the safety. But then again, I mean, it gets kind of hard to pin down because arguably an underage drinking prohibition is meant to protect health and safety. So I'm just thinking out loud right now, but I think it would be good to spend some time seeing if we could narrow that.
And to the gentleman's point, and we'll kind of, in fact, what we may do is as we walk through this, jump in as it's appropriate. My concern is the subparagraph B below seeks to limit that. I'm sorry, C below.
Right. That's a great point.
It's intending to be much more rigorous, but a violation of state law is as simple as consumption of alcohol swallows that more rigorous limiting factor that I think you're trying to accomplish. So I think
exactly.
Okay.
I have a question for Representative McLaren.
Sure.
Just now, you never went to that Blue Sky Lounge when you were, underage, were you?
I would like to state on the record that outside of de minimis consumption that was supervised, I did not drink in the United States of America before the age of 21. And that's why I'm such a pain in the ass on
He
the
pleads
House
the fifth,
floor.
ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, there you go. But yes, I left the country for that. All right. So all of that just to say, I think the chair's right. It would make sense to me to tighten line 25. Moving on, the next thing that I noticed is the definition of serious bodily injury at lines 57 to 60. And
Actually, let's do this. I'm
Okay.
gonna take us, since this is a working meeting. Let's walk through this bill if we could,
That's what I
as
was
we
wondering.
go. And
Sure.
Yeah.
and Chairman Bouchette, jump in, or if Representative Smith, jump in as we walk through the lines. Just kind of raise a question you may have as we go through it. I'm going to raise one for line 31. Experience this again for those who are listening. And one of the conditions that would lead to hazing is experience threatened or actual physical injury for a number of circumstances, or severe emotional distress. I know it's up to fact finders to establish what severe emotional distress would be. And I know 12 people in a jury box have a lot of walking around sense amongst them. What's your goal here? I want to, because what I want to do is I want to make sure we're clear. There may be uncertainty that fact patterns of real cases bring to the cases, but I do think we're called to kind of try to be clear. And if it's the best we can do, I mean, is crying. You walk into a house, sorority house, fraternity house, some kid is crying, not just, but sobbing loud, just, is it, if it renders someone to visible, audible tears, is that severe emotional distress? Or is there or should we flesh that out? Are you looking for a higher threshold than that?
Yeah, I guess when we put severe in there, that was the distinguishment between, someone just being emotional or they're upset about something versus something that's so severe that, they think this is going to, literally ruin their reputation, their livelihood, their anything else. And you can probably imagine the stories, or perhaps you've watched a movie or two over the years that may have probably clearly demonstrate how some of that stuff had happened. I can only leave that to your imagination. I've got many examples, but probably none that I want to say on camera.
Is it your goal? And I'm not, this is no, there's no trickery. Is your goal that essentially if a kid comes to conclude that I'm going to, and let's just take the Greek organization context since it was raised earlier. I don't want to limit it to that, but if a kid perceives that they're going to get booted from the pledge process, and if they don't do Act A, they're going to get booted for it. Some kids would appropriate different levels of value to that. Some kids are third generation, legacies, and it's a big deal. They have a whole range of that. Is it your goal if a kid perceives there's no physical threat as such, but if I don't do Act A, I'm gonna fail the pledge process, I'm out? Is it your goal? Is it that level of?
No, not at all. It's really if they've done something to truly harm the person. It's not meant to be a threatening, nature. And I'll give you an example of that. Down in Florida, if you remember, there was a band member who was killed several years ago, right? And their deal was you had to do what was called run the gauntlet, right? And in running the gauntlet, they beat him to death, right? Well, severe emotional distress might be to them is, well, what if they're telling me I got to run the gauntlet right now, right? And I know somebody died from this, right? That could be severe distress. Or in some cases, earlier, Senator Harold Jones talked about the bill of revenge pornography and other stuff, where they literally would take pictures of folks and doing certain things, et cetera, and then use those to threaten that person based on the fact that they don't do certain other things in tandem. So again, it's meant to be severe. Look, this is the real world too. People are going to get their feelings hurt, and that's okay. We all know that working in politics, right? We all have to have broad shoulders, but there's a difference between the two, I believe.
Okay. I want to understand. So is if acceptance into a Greek organization or the failure thereof for not doing something, is that considered enough of a severe emotional distress?
No, that wouldn't be the case at all. Like some people are going to go into those organizations. Some people are not. Some by their choice, some by not. This is, and it won't only just happen for those folks who are trying to get into the organization. In fact, a lot of the things that we have gotten specific examples of were not what I thought was when that person is pledging that sorority or fraternity. It's actually happening to folks even later on, unfortunately. Not that any of it's good.
So again, on line 31, medically verifiable physical harm or severe emotional distress. If medically verifiable, and I know that counsel can help us, commas matter. But if severe emotional distress is a medically verifiable thing, then I think that's a pretty safe threshold to work with. I don't know if it's the gentleman's intention to do that. Those are the kind of things I'm talking about, where we want to make sure we've got the right sets of conditions. Medically verifiable severe emotional distress would seem to give rise to something that's a high misdemeanor. I think that's what I'm just trying to think my way through that.
So, Mr. Chairman, in the wording there, I guess maybe I'm reading medically verifiable physical harm or severe medical stress. I think that maybe you're reading this different. I'm not an attorney, so you'd be much smarter than this than me, but I thought the medically verifiable would pertain to both physical harm or severe emotional distress. Are you saying we need to double add it, or?
My guess is that an English major knows better than an attorney, but I think that I just want to make sure if it's your goal to make sure medically verifiable is that sometimes we can do these things. You can create in this subparagraph yet another. It can sort of be tabular, so you can see what modifies what. Sometimes the comma structure of this makes it a little unclear.
Okay.
You know, I'm not saying you got to go do that, but I want to make sure we're all clear about exactly what we're saying.
I think the medically verifiable physical harm, the medically verifiable also, in my reading of it, would address the severe emotional distress. I also noticed that emotional and mental emotional distress is also mentioned in 35. So this is an expansion of what we got already on hazing. Is that correct? We're going to add this emotional aspect, and to me, it starts. You know, the emotional distress is somewhat of a term of art in the legal industry. You know, it brings to mind a IIED claim, IIED, intentional infliction of emotional distress.
Right.
Are you intentionally, or are you wanting to go into one of those types of measurings in this emotional distress edition, or?
Candidly, we had not gotten into that thought process in general. It was really to make sure that if you are, locking people in a basement and doing strobe lights in their eyes and blaring loud music and smacking a baseball bat right next to their head, that would cause severe emotional distress. So things of that nature, and that is sadly a real-time example.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I also wanted to add, we go back up to 21. This is just a structural thing. We've got to force or subject on line 21. And I think subject was originally there, and without these additions, it read correctly to me. In reading it now, if we read it as subject, I don't know how you subject, how that works in the sentences. Means to force or subject a minor or student to perform. So how do you subject a student to perform? And I think that's just
So yeah, I could give you an example of that. Group of young women, as an example, are wanting to join a sorority, right? And they say, to join this sorority, you're all going to start, passing this bottle of pure grain alcohol around, start drinking it, right? Now, they didn't hold a gun to the head and force them to do that, right? But they also know that they're not going to be able to join the sorority if they don't, right? So this was taken from language from the version of the Max Gruber Act that became law ultimately in the state of Louisiana, where the incident had occurred. So that was with the reason of adding the force or subject, right? So in the force, thing, it's one thing that you're saying that you're going to do this or else, right? People have, as an example, been forced into the trunk of a car, right, and driven 20 miles out of town and dropped off somewhere. That's being forced.
So how do you, okay, I think I understand where you're going with that, but and if we continue on, it means to subject a minor or student to, perform an activity, or which causes a likely, or is likely to cause the minor or student to violate. If I could work on the structure just a little bit, I could clean this language up.
I would love your help.
I think the chair's saying maybe a force a certain set of circumstances and then subject certain, split those out because the behaviors are,
And-
It's
and
just a structural thing.
And I would just like to say that first off, I very much appreciate the feedback and any effort to perfect it and make it better. Not only am I open, but I would sincerely appreciate your wisdom and input from all of you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, anything else?
Well, I have this thing marked all up, Mr. Chairman.
While we're on page 2, let's stay on page 2. I'll let, between the chair and Representative McLaurin and myself, anything. Are there any members of the committee that are not present that would like to jump in? I tell you, let's do this. This is Chairman Burchett. If you could go through page 2 with your issues, then I'll recognize Representative McLaurin for his. In fact, he still has the floor, I think. And then we'll go to other members.
So in line 34, I mentioned this earlier. I think the intent is to add that subjects the
To the
minor
minor,
or
yeah.
student and not the other person
Certainly.
there. I
Yep.
think that's what should go there, to an unreasonable risk. Again, I just mentioned the D, if we could tighten this language up to adhere to what exactly activities you're trying to address. And I think to the chairman's point about, this out with physical activity, like in the scenario that he mentioned where a fraternity or sorority could say, well, we're making them do jumping jacks in the rain because we're training them for, flag football or whatever. I mean, that might be something we need to tighten up. This addition of emotional distress, just want to try to get to the bottom of what we're after there. If we're going to go into a intentional infliction of emotional distress type analysis, I want to further dig into that. And
Anything else on page 2, Mr. Chairman?
that's all I got on 2.
Representative McLaurin, anything else on page 2?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think that I'm actually a little concerned about 3435, the phrase adversely affects the physical health or safety. I mean, one broad policy question here is, what do we want to allow these organizations to do, right? I mean, at some point you can't completely cut out the fun of initiation rights. And I mean that broadly, right? There are initiation rights to all these groups. And the question is, when do they start to harm people? And I just want to point out that it says unreasonable risk of harm, which implies that there is such thing as a reasonable risk of harm, right? And so I think, if you think about a reasonable risk of harm being something that our public policy is to allow for, then I think theoretically there are circumstances like, for example, jumping jacks in the rain, you could slip and fall, right? That could adversely affect the physical health or safety. I mean, writ large, adversely affecting physical health. If I sprain my ankle, it's, on accident. So I guess my point is, it might be good to say, adversely change that adversely affects physical health or safety line to maybe include an element of unreasonability or unreasonableness like the previous clause does. Or to ramp up the nature of the harm and say, that seriously and adversely affects, something like that, just to make sure that it doesn't sweep too broadly.
And that's a good point. I give you an example of what I would think would be reasonable risk. When I was a young man a very long time ago, we had to strike a match into the Greek alphabet 3 times, right? Before that match came down and you tossed out of your hand because you're afraid of burning your fingers, right? It's pretty reasonable, right? Nobody's gonna get too harmed by that one.
Well, and I asked this question because I think you're going to get different answers to that. I think different Georgians would say different things about that. There are some Georgians, I think, who would say fun that doesn't hurt you is just fun, right? Where other Georgians would say, anytime you're using the social control that is available to the leaders of these organizations to make people do things that are risky at all, that's an inherent social evil. And so that's one discussion we haven't done a deep dive into, is what exactly is the public policy on initiation rights being a little bit coercive and using social control to achieve that coercion. So, I haven't taken a firm position on that because we haven't had the discussion. But
And is there an ability for people over the 18 years of age and older to contract that certain things can happen? I know that this is, can one person say, hey, because of my aspiration to be part of this organization, I'm willing to consent to certain kinds of things to happen. I'm willing to consent to certain kinds of simple batteries, whatever the case may be, what is an appropriate level of liberty that we would give somebody to be able to subject themselves to? I mean, I don't know that Greek organizations in particular ask someone to sign a waiver form. We're going to ask you to waive that you can do certain things. I know in a military context, at least when I was serving in them, I trust it's not changed. There's a special training course where you're subjected to a POW camp setting, and it's survival, escape, resistance, and evasion. And you actually sign a waiver allowing certain things that you're able to. There's simple batteries, some things like that. It's part of, quote, roughing you up in this training circumstance. The one we consent to, you can't be ordered to take it, but you can. So if there's a legitimate training interest there, I just use that as one specific example of my limited experience. But what can people not consent to? And is this creating a structure where someone could, with a very good fraternity lawyer, that would prevent otherwise adults from consenting to certain kind of behavior that would be outside of the boundaries of what you prescribe here? And is that your intention?
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point about, signing the disclaimer, if you will, right? I mean, I have to sign one when I took my son go-kart riding and saw my life away, I think. So based on the way he was driving, that was probably a good move on their part. But, that's a good point. I had not thought through that, Mr. Chairman. I'd have to probably give that some more consideration.
And again, I'm not trying to prejudge that. I just, the question would arise, is this something that an attorney couldn't write a consent? Because again, as you go further down the bill, it talks about consent shall not be a defense to some of these things. How does that play in the totality of this bill? And should we allow a certain circumstance? And maybe it's an enumerated set of things, but anything that you can waive in a civil setting through a contract, anything outside of that, I don't think you can waive access to the state bringing a criminal case against somebody. That's not waivable by a private individual unless it hinges on this issue of consent. If anything in here is going to be the consent element that you can, hey, this letter gives me consent to do all these things that you're talking about. I want to at least ask that question.
And Mr. Chair, if I could, to me, just the conversation's helping. It seems like where we cross the line, because there's value in initiation rights. I mean, the idea of shared struggle, like you say with, basic training, for example, the idea that people go through adverse settings together and then they become closer as a result. And I think that's what that's bonds that anybody feels. I mean, even a freshman class in the legislature, you go through the same sort of, well, we didn't like that vote and we all took that vote together, and that's a memory we'll all share, right? And it's adverse, and that helps with the bonding. I don't think that's in dispute, but I think maybe where it starts to cross in the level of the state has an interest in interfering is some level of physical harm, some level of emotional harm, and then also from the perpetrator end of it, using social control in a cruel or abusive way, right? And to me, those three harms are sort of what are swimming around in this discussion. And I do think an emotional harm is legitimate, but I agree that it has to be something that's beyond just, I'm stressed about the initiation right? Because that's part of the adversity that I think we experience when we're bonding over an initiation right, is we're stressed about whether we're going to make it through, and I don't mean it literally. I just mean, are we going to be on the team? Are we going to be included? Is this going to work out? Right. And this is coming from somebody who wasn't even in a Greek organization. So I didn't, personally go through that, but I've had similar settings. So I think I can understand. So all that just to say, I think maybe using a frame like that to think about abusive control, right? Physical harm, and then some threshold of emotional harm should be a lodestar for.
And has the environment crossed outside of the context of otherwise where consent's been given? Because I think these people who were, for whatever reason, staying on a rooftop or being shoved down in a hole with a blanket for 12 hours, I don't sense that there was ever this moment where I'm not going down there, you can't get me, and they're forced, they're shoved down there almost like they're being kidnapped. I get the sense they said, okay, I'm going to go do this. So the consent was still there. So is what we're talking about, even giving consent, still going to be a crime, or in some cases a felony? We have to wrestle with that.
That's a very good point, Mr. Chairman.
And it's important to remember too that the felony definition of this, to the credit of the bill as it's currently drafted, has an element of force in it.
Yep.
So I think that that's relevant when thinking about how these definitions interplay, because it's going to require both the, if I'm reading it right, the force and serious bodily injury. So that is at least a limiting factor.
Okay. While we're on page 2, other members of the committee, anything else? Anybody? Chair recognizes Representative Kendrick for a question on page 2. Representative Kendrick.
My question was for page 4, so you're good until page 4.
Okay. Any other members on page 2? Hearing none, we're on to page 3. Hey, we're making progress here, guys.
All right.
Any members of the subcommittee? Chairman recognizes Representative McLaurin.
Thanks. So the definition of serious bodily injury on 57 through 60 does not have any specific definition. It just says it includes, and I think it makes sense to include sort of the normal case for what we worry about in hazing settings, you know, overconsumption of alcohol. I wonder, I mean, I think my understanding of how this would work out is this is an element of the offense. It would go to the jury. Without a definition, you wouldn't get a legal jury instruction on what it means. So we would be leaving juries to decide what serious bodily injury was. I mean, I suppose that courts could come up with a jury instruction that models serious bodily injury off of other places where it exists in the law. And so I guess my sort of question / comment is, do you happen to know how serious bodily injury would be defined currently in the law? I haven't done a deep dive, or would we just leave it to juries? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I'm not familiar of how that would pertain to existing law, Representative. I thought it would be more specific to the courts.
I think there is a definition of serious bodily injury in the code in a couple places. We could cite that one. The one that comes to mind is a threat of a permanent impact of a major bodily organ. There's a definition. We could borrow that by reference. We could restate it here. I think that would be a better approach maybe than a jury instruction that's sort of left open.
Yeah, leaving it to a jury. I mean, serious is such a vague word. I think we all have instincts about this stuff, but at the end of the day, you know, what you worry about, I think, in terms of an overzealous prosecution for a case like this is, you know, we use my blue sky example, but somebody who has like an anxiety disorder or something, who gets really bent out of shape, but for actual medical reasons, right, over what would ordinarily not harm very many children, right? And then that ends up parlaying into felony liability because a jury moved by the story, you know, decides that this is serious enough. You know, that's, you worry about sort of that elasticity in words like this. So I think I agree with the chair that it would be a good idea to at least anchor the definition of serious bodily injury, but also to include the caveat that no matter what it means in that cross-reference, it also includes overconsumption of alcohol, the way that it's defined.
Okay, very good. I'll do some homework on that one.
I think that's all I've got for
Okay.
page 3.
Anything else? Chairman recognizes Chairman Burchett.
Senator, the on lines 59, 0.25 grams or more blood alcohol concentration, is that like, did we come to that number for some particular reason? And then my further question is, if any of this action is, if one of these persons in a sorority or fraternity is drinking and you know, falling victim to this social pressure, and then they get a DUI, would that be serious bodily injury by this?
Rephrase. So you're saying if they got a DUI, I'm not sure that's would be serious bodily injury, right? I mean,
Well, I mean, if they blew 0.25, I guess that's why this 0.25 came up, or is there another reason the 0.25 came up?
no, just it was at the time. If I remember correctly, that would be them blowing basically a 0.08, so they would be drunk. So,
Okay. Okay. So if they get drunk after one of these events, then that's considered serious bodily harm, or is this like
well,
really
emergency
drunk?
medical attention, right? So
Okay.
I mean, that's, you know, stomach getting pumped and things of that nature, right?
Okay.
So, and of course, it's very different for different people, right? So the 90-pound young lady is a lot different than, you know, the 350-pound guy. I mean, they're going to obviously handle that a lot differently.
Oh, okay. So the way I read this, Senator, is that consumption of alcohol liquid and requires emergency medical attention, or which results in 0.25.
Right.
So it doesn't have to, they don't have to get their stomach pumped.
Right, but again, it's still seriously bodily injury. We're trying to say if that's more than just drinking too much.
Okay. I guess I'm asking a poor question, but let me ask you, is
I'm probably
0.25,
answering poor too.
is 0.25 just really drunk?
I got to look it up real quick just to make sure I'm not talking out of turn.
Senator
You
Roberts?
probably would know, yes.
0.25 is way intoxicated, especially for someone who is not conditioned to consuming alcohol. Thank you, Mr. Chair. What number are you? 12. Mr. Chair, 0.25 for someone who is not a lifelong alcoholic, if you will, would be extremely dangerous. I have ran on Intox one lady who went 0.38, but she probably walked around daily with a 0.24 because she drank constantly and she could move around fine. And then I've ran juveniles on the Intox who were 0.06 who could barely stand up because their body was not acclimated to the effect that alcohol would have. But 0.25 on the average, which I would say 90+% of Americans would be extremely intoxicated.
And to the gentleman's point, we actually have a framework, and I don't know exactly where it is in Title 40, but it refers to there's a threshold of 0.15, which is a sort of a threshold we use in some contexts for being extremely drunk. And I don't know, you may know the citing in there, but it's I need to pull it out, but I know we've wrestled with it in this room before. 0.08 is of course the legal definition of drunk. There's a 0.15 threshold.
Almost double, yeah.
Yeah, which is used. So 0.25 would be way up there.
Oh, so I guess the point really is that if this is like 0.25 and they're passed out, can't articulate any words or can't walk or anything like that, then I think that makes sense. I was just wondering if it's possible for someone to be socially drinking and meet this 0.25.
Yeah, good question. That was chosen to be mirrored to the Louisiana version of statute as well. So I probably have to defer back to some of their wisdom. But I thank Senator Robertson back there, who's got great experience in these matters.
It's always good to have law enforcement.
Career, that is.
There you go.
Okay.
Senator, I got one more thing. The language on line 62 who has been accepted for admissions to school. Do you have any idea what we're trying to capture there?
That would be so. Let's say someone came from. Representative McLaurin went to UGA, right? If he was down visiting a friend in Georgia Tech and just, showed up somewhere and did something, he was not, attending or enrolled in that school and trying to become a part of that organization or in that organization, right? So
Okay.
this wouldn't necessarily apply to him if he was going over to Georgia Tech at that time. Does that make sense?
So it's limiting, I suppose.
But if there were a pre-school year, pre-enrollment activity, the summer of, July of, or whatever, that's sort of leading into that could apply.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Representative McLaurin, anything? Anybody on page 3? Hearing none, moving on to page 4. Chair recognizes Representative Kendrick for a question.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Albers, for this. My question is about lines 81 through 86. So starting at E1, that talks about any person who directs, encourages, participates in, or engages in a prolonged observation of an act of alleged hazing. Is there any other circumstance in which we punish or there's liability for someone just engaging in a prolonged observation of an act? Or am I reading this? I want to make sure I'm reading this sentence wrong.
No, that's a great question. Oh, I'm getting a little feedback here. That's a great question. I believe that we were all in office when we had passed a lot of the updates on helping those who were opioid addicts, and especially those who maybe needed Narcan or other type solutions. So if somebody's watching someone continually do this, right, and happening, right, it's really to get that person who's encouraging, participating to do something about it, right? Not just to sit there and to know this is going to be bad and just say, well, I wasn't the person who was physically putting them to harm, but I was watching someone going into self-destruct mode or by somebody forcing them to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Kendrick, any further questions?
No, well, if I can sort of do a follow-up. So, for example, if there is a school fight and there are students, this might be a little different because they're minors, but there are students that are observing a fight. Is it currently the practice that the person who is observing the fight has some sort of liability as well? Is that a similar sort of analogous?
That's a great, no, that's a great example, right? In that case, they're not meant to jump into the middle of the fight, but they can certainly call on someone to assist them, whether it be emergency medical services, somebody's harmed, or the proper authorities or things of that nature, but not just to sit there and watch people continue to get harmed. It's really just to have, I guess it would be the basics of just accountability and responsibility that we would hope people would want to do naturally, but I just don't think some people are doing that.
Right. Mr. Chair, can I have one more follow-up? Because that
You got the floor, you bet.
I don't see it anywhere in the bill, and I'm looking at the version that's on the website on my computer. So if somebody fails to act, they didn't directly encourage or participate in it, but they engaged in a prolonged observation of this act and didn't do anything. Is there going to be some civil liability on their part for failing to act? Is there somewhere in the bill that there's liability? Or
well, if you look right below the section that you had referenced, Representative, on 87, it talks about what happens if they fail to render reasonable assistance, right? And then they could be guilty of a misdemeanor of high and aggravated nature. So obviously that's criminal and not civil. However, I would lean back, perhaps even Representative McLaurin might know that anybody could civilly sue anybody for anything, right? So they could bring an action against them, and likely, what I've seen in the past is usually, the criminal's followed by the civil in one way or form. So, and he's giving me the nodding yes. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Representative McLaurin.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I think Senator Albers brings up a really good point. We have to think about the backdrop of the civil remedies that exist here. Some of these situations, I think, maybe criminal liability. I can understand why we're thinking about it. But my concern is, and this is sort of a 1L criminal law type thing when you go to law school, that there's a big difference in how we treat affirmative acts that we apply the criminal law to versus omissions, the idea that somebody fails to do something. And it's a much bigger lift to add a criminal penalty for somebody's failure to do something as opposed to actually doing it. Another example we discussed very briefly before committee, before the mics were on, was the idea of mandatory reporter, right? That, there can be criminal penalties if you're aware of certain abuse contexts, you don't report, right? And we think that those situations are serious enough, I think rightly, to put a criminal penalty on it. So, again, going into the kind of the normal hypothetical here, we're in a basement and there's 10 kids and there's beer everywhere and somebody is being forced to drink to excess. Are we comfortable putting a high and aggravated misdemeanor on all 10 of those kids? That's one thing I wonder. And the other thing is, even if we're comfortable with it, my second sort of point of contention here, wondering if there's something we can do, is I worry that the obligation here is of giving reasonable assistance is like a cooks in the kitchen problem if you're requiring every single person in the room to do something. And the question is, what do they do? Well, maybe one kid calls 911. Okay. Another kid says, I'm not going to call 911 because I know that, Scott is calling 911. Is that a legally ambiguous
And
situation?
Josh McLaurin, who's an Eagle Scout, is doing an awesome job. So I'm not going to mess it up. I'm going to kind of watch this happen because it's going great.
Well, you think that it's taken care of, right? And now granted, a jury could say, well, that's reasonable assistance to, but the problem is I've actually seen legal context before where a court might say, well, unfortunately the statute says give reasonable assistance, which means do something, and it can't be nothing. Whatever it is can't be nothing, right? So I wonder if it would make sense here, and maybe I'd like to get your instant reaction to this if you have one. Would it make sense to put in a causation requirement and say that if the failure to act results in harm to the student or minor, and I mean any harm, right? Because then you've got at least a causation element that protects the accused, right? Because for example, if I'm the person who doesn't call 911, but somebody else does, and there's no delay in medical personnel showing up because the person who called 911 was successful in getting through, well, my failure to call 911 did not cause anybody harm, more so than they would have been harmed, right? So,
Well, 82 does say which results in. I don't know if it's strong enough to tie together.
well, but so that the problem is what that does is it identifies the class of individuals who could be subject to the high and aggravated misdemeanor liability. So again, we're all in the basement, right? We're all watching what is hazing. But the question is, okay, we just realized it went too far. This person is now seriously thrown up, they're sick, whatever. Somebody's got to call 911. Scott calls 911, but nobody else, everyone else stands there paralyzed, which I think is probably a pretty likely scenario in a situation like that, right? My worry here is that this creates high and aggravated misdemeanor liability if you fail to take a specific action, and the action is called give reasonable assistance, right? Now, I guess it says to the extent possible without danger or peril to himself or other, but I think I would be more comfortable with this because again, it's a big deal when you criminalize an omission. So I think I would be more comfortable putting a causation and a harm requirement in there that says provided that the failure to act caused physical harm to, and I don't care how expansive that harm is. I just want the causation element there, if that makes sense, to make sure that the omission actually caused some sort of harm, and it wasn't just we're criminalizing the omission writ large. Does that make sense?
If I could take your example and maybe turn it back the other way, because I hear what you're saying, it makes sense. If it's a person who fails to render reasonable assistance or knowingly did not participate, just something with the fact that using your example of the basement, right? I mean, if I know that Scott went and he's called 911, it's on. Well, okay, the reasonable assistance had happened, right? I've witnessed it happen. I know what's happening, right? Then I'm okay, right? And even if the guy ends up being okay, right? He didn't need a stomach pump. He just got sick because he had too many chili dogs before he got there that night. I'm just trying to.
Well, I guess I'm just because I think we're all on the same page about who this is supposed to cover,
Right.
But I think the idea would be, let's put it this way: if things start to get out of hand, and somebody promptly calls 911, I don't want the other 9 kids in the room to be criminally liable because they just quote unquote stood there. So I think maybe one smart thing that could work is in line 87, a person who fails to render reasonable assistance as required by the subsection comma, and which failure causes harm to the student or minor. You do something like that, and then all of a sudden, you're only going to criminalize the omission if you can show causation. So where I would see this working, you've got a situation where all in the basement, but nobody makes the phone call, right? And the person deteriorates, suffers serious bodily injury, or dies as a result of everyone's failure to act. Now you've got a situation where the omission caused the harm, and you can see that, right? I think this part of the statute to me seems like it should apply. Well, it's supposed to apply where people don't make the call in time. I don't want it to be ambiguous about whether it applies to somebody who's in the room while a call is being made.
And then you also have the circumstance, not to what if this to death, but another kid says, hey, so-and-so said they called 911. I think I'm okay. 911 maybe wasn't called, or it was that they really called somebody. They called the campus police. There wasn't an adequate response based on where they were. So I mean, I would, if I were accused of this as a student, I'd say, I thought Josh called him. He said he called him. I'm good. I mean, you prove him beyond a reasonable doubt. Again, it's that inherent issue of criminalizing passive acts. This is a good discussion to have. I don't want, we may not get resolution around the table, but it is a,
Yeah. And this,
and one could say there could be some safety in that, as long as you can demonstrate to a jury, hey, you know, I thought it was being taken care of. Maybe you couldn't get convicted, but you're also, you're dragging a house full of kids into a criminal context. I don't know if that happens, but I do think we've got to sort it out. I think we can't just say, well, they'll figure it out on the ground. I do want to make sure we can figure it out.
no, and I agree with that. And getting back to Representative McLaurin, I mean, somebody could say, well, I called my sister, she's a nursing student, right? And I left a message, right? That probably wouldn't be an appropriate, reasonable assistance, although they may say, well, I thought we did the right thing because, Susie was coming over and she's a second-year nursing student. So I hear what you're saying. I'll work on some wordsmithing on that one.
And I'm hearing Representative McLaurin say, you wouldn't be as concerned about a civil right of action for someone's inaction. If someone passively stood by and watched this, maybe they could be civilly responsible, but the criminal responsibility is a very, very different.
It's really two things. It's both that, the idea that there's already some sort of legal response to that omission, to hold someone accountable. But number two, a civil action has an element of causation. You have to show in that civil lawsuit that the failure to act is what caused a resulting harm. So I think it's appropriate for a criminal penalty that's based fundamentally on that same idea that your failure to act, you've got to, I would like to see a causation link. That's that one extra layer of protection. So a jury says, not only did that person not do anything, but we're confident enough to say that it was their failure not, to do something exactly that caused some sort of resulting harm to occur. But like I say, I don't think there needs to be any stringent requirement on the nature of that harm. All I'm looking for is just that causation element to show any harm from that omission, because you're already narrowing in 81 to 82 the group of people that you would attach this to, which is the people in the basement, right?
Yeah, got it.
So I've got a question or two. Anybody from the committee has a question on page 4 while we're there? Chair recognizes Chairman Burchett.
Senator Albert, is this section here, section E1, is it the only place, or is there in case law a requirement where we're creating this duty, or will this create the duty then to essentially report or give reasonable?
So this was modeled, as I
Reasonable
was mentioning
assistance.
earlier about, the answer to the opioid epidemic, right? So you're watching someone who is overdosing right in front of you. You have to do something about it. But likewise, we also gave them the protection if they actually did something about it, even if they were also one of the consumers, right? So it was very much modeled off of that type of language.
Okay, all right. So I get that. That's great. But this is the first enumerated place in the code that we're going to require this duty if you're watching hazing, that you have to.
Correct.
Okay. All right. That's my first question. And acting. All right. That's all I had. That's the only question I had. Thanks.
My questions are on D1 and D2, lines 72 through 80. I get I do want to sort of parenthetically ask, with the element of force, is element of force fleshed out? Is that something that I'm just asking this to the committee more broadly, is with the element of force, is that a fleshed out in Title 16? I'm struggling to recount where that may be in Georgia law in Title 16 as that. Representative McLaurin.
Mr. Chair, I'm not specifically aware of whether the element of force, like where that's used. I'm fairly comfortable with it. I mean, what I would do is go to Georgia House District 18 and put up a billboard that says that I'm comfortable with this felony. That's a joke.
I was laughing.
Thank you, Senator. But no, I mean, ultimately you're talking about a situation where coercion is
Yeah.
implied. And I think any sort of now physical force might be, I think, a little preferable here because, you know, or implied physical force, because at the end of the day, social pressure is going to be really strong in these situations. And that's part of the evil that we're trying to regulate here, is that this social pressure can add up in such a way as to put kids in really dangerous situations. So, you know, I think it would be tough to say, and I don't know what element of force would be adding if it just meant social coercion, right? Because you're already defining hazing as force or subject to, or whatever formulation, you know, Chairman Burchett ends up coming up with. I think what we're trying to refine here is it's not just hazing, it's also hazing in a situation where somebody doesn't necessarily feel free physically to leave the situation, or to, and correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe there's a different line in the sand we want to draw here, because we maybe don't want to limit the felony just to cases where it's effectively false imprisonment, for example. You know, you lock the door, okay, you got to drink the beers and come out. But, you know, something that's more so than just force or subject, I think would be appropriate here. So I would maybe like to see an adjective that qualifies force somehow.
I say that I did my simple sort of search of OCGA for quote element of force. It's not used here, and Gactol may have something to add to this. They're subject to being called on when they're part of our committee hearings. I'm not critical of it because I think I understand what's happening here. I'm just stylistically, if there's a way that we normally would say that in Georgia law, I want to make sure we're saying it in ways that's consistent, or that might tap into other case law and so forth. So I raise that parenthetically. But my questions about D1 and D2 were, particularly D2. I read D2 to be very similar to an involuntary manslaughter circumstance where, you know, there was an element of force. You know, you're wrongfully committing an act, and a death happens as a result of that. I see that as 16.5.3 involuntary manslaughter, which is 1 to 10 years. I'm just going to ask the question, and I would ask the prosecution attorney's counsel, perhaps, are there any lenity issues that are raised in this, that there might be the same fact pattern, same elements, where there could be a more severe criminal penalty for what happens here on the uglier end of the fact pattern? What you're getting at is on the lighter end of the fact pattern, meaning not the level of ugliness perhaps that you might see in what you typically think about as a murder or manslaughter, but this coercion, these acts that the consequent was death. You're essentially restating what I see as involuntary manslaughter here, which is a 1 to 10. But I want to make sure, and I know the gentleman's an ardent supporter of public safety, that we wouldn't create any lenity issues by how this is framed. So it's just something we have to do some more homework on.
Okay, thank you.
And that's all I saw there on page 4. I want to skip through these things. I don't want to be sensitive to time today, but anything on page 5 for members of the committee? Chair recognizes the chairman.
Chairman, going back to 4 real quick, 91, 92, that was that language you were talking about, the expressed or implied consent of the minor or student. It should not be the offensive hazing. So we've got to, I think we need to reconcile that with, what were we talking about earlier that we brought that up? I put it in a note somewhere.
The chair was talking about the idea of contracting,
right.
that you're giving your
Consenting to this
consent, and
thing.
that maybe
That's right.
we need to allow for kids to, or children, you know, young adults to have some sort of ability to assume the risk, more or less.
So with that said, this new offense is anybody 17 years of older that with the element of force commits the offense of hazing when he does whatever he does to force him to do that. That means that the minor is, in this case, is 18-year-olds. An 18-year-old could sign a waiver and consent to whatever it is that they're doing, whatever action they're doing. So I think we do need to reconcile that. I'm just reaffirming that.
Thank you. Sorry. So I accept the chair's point as sort of a philosophical concern about how much consent somebody's able to give. The truth is the criminal law will override any sort of contract or waiver. I mean, the statutes routinely, decide which contracts are against or in compliance with public policy, right? So I think it seems like to me that it's not like, I'll put it this way. The idea that we have language in the bill that says express or implied consent's not a defense does not take away the concept of consent from what we're doing, because ultimately we're deciding where to draw the line on what hazing is. And so whatever it is we define hazing to be will override any sort of idea of consent. But clearly you can consent to everything short of whatever is defined as the crime of hazing, if that makes sense. It's what we're saying is consent will never operate within the boundaries of what we have defined as hazing. And so we just, to the chair's point, need to define hazing in a way that's narrow enough where we feel like it's not impinging on an idea of consent that we think should be working, I think.
I definitely get the point, but I think you hit on it in the last little bit. This definition of hazing at this point, I would say, is not super narrow.
I agree with that.
While I understand the point, I think we need to, like you said, we either need to narrowly tailor that or deal with this this consent issue. Either one will work for me.
And I would express a preference for narrowing the scope of the crime, only because part of what we're dealing with here is a situation where consent is nominally given in probably in almost every circumstance, right? You're the one pledging, you're the one signing up for the, you didn't have to participate in this, but you chose to. And I think what we're saying as a public policy of state, and tell me if you disagree with me, Senator, is regardless of what you said the student or the minor consented to, these acts are inherently coercive, and we want this criminal statute to override that consent. So whatever we define the boundaries of the offense as, I would think would be where we want to,
Chairman Setzler, on page 5, I think that's where we just moved to. To me, lines 93 through 96 and lines 113 through 116 are a little bit in conflict. It's a customary tradition in line 93, 94, and then in 113 and 14 is customary. But I think this is what Senator Albers was saying was the clause that was to capture the NCAA and the ROTC programs. So I just wanted to kind of make sure we reconcile those two clauses to make sure they're not conflicting.
And if I could, you bring up a good point. So if you look at the beginning, on line 93, if a sorority says, well, we've been doing this ritual to young ladies for 100 years, even though it's blatantly a terrible thing to do. That's a little different than, we have the first thing you do is you run 2 miles before you start soccer practice. I played soccer, right? So, the first thing we had to do was run 2 miles, right? That's reasonable and customary, different than doing something that would be physically torturesome, right?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I've got a concern about lines 97 through 100. Y'all know I love a good defense to liability, but I worry that this is really broad. I'll give you an example. We're talking about the basement scenario with the failure to act or failure to report. The way I read G1 is if you act in good faith, well, I'm just reading the text, I guess, and in a timely manner, you report that hazing's happening. Now, it does also say you take reasonable steps to prevent the hazing. But then the defense here is shall not be subject to civil or criminal liability arising from the incident at all. So, okay, so maybe you take reasonable steps to prevent the hazing. I think that language does a lot of work because it means you're not one of the actors that is affirmatively furthering the hazing, right? You're not one of the ringleaders, I guess. But if you're in the room and you have that obligation to report and you don't, to medical personnel or call 911, right? I guess in a timely manner could do that. The problem is you're sort of creating duplicate language that sort of, tries to re-express the same obligation to report from the previous page. And so my worry is that this defense would end up letting people off in situations where they did have an obligation to, report to medical personnel or whatever, and failed to do so. You see what I'm saying? The in the timely manner language to me is duplicative of give reasonable assistance, or including by requesting medical attention, right? So my concern is maybe if those two things don't line up exactly, the timing on, the offense doesn't line up for the timing for the defense, that you have a situation where the defense is overbroad and allows people to escape. And I'm also concerned about the civil liability defense there, because it makes sense to me to end the criminal liability defense. But if you've got, if there's civil liability, I understand reasonable steps to prevent the hazing is doing a lot. But if you're caught up in the situation and you're slow to act, does that person still deserve full civil and criminal defense?
My guess would be, and you'd be much more astute in this than I would be, they would define if they were going to bring a civil action, well, you did not act in a timely manner, right? And that would be their cause, right, of why they're bringing the civil action. That would be my thought process. Again, this was all modeled against the issue we're having with opioids.
And I think what I see the author doing is I see him casting a very broad net with a very broad statute, and then having some fairly expansive exemptions to get out of that by these exemption clauses. So we got to make sure these things marry up and that we're not tripping on ourselves.
Well, and so, for example, school official, which school official? I mean, you could call a school official has no responsibility over these issues and be compliant with this. So I guess my question is, all right, so reasonable steps. You tell your friends who are going to the basement, y'all don't go to the basement. I think it's a bad idea. Those are your reasonable steps, right? Then you get down there and you realize what's happening. I know this is pretty bespoke, but I'm just thinking through it. And then you call somebody else who's an employee at the school, and that's a full civil defense. You know what I mean? This may not end up mattering that much, or may not come up a lot. Anytime you're trying to address the same conduct with multiple sets of concepts and language, that was really my main concern about that. But as written, I understand why the defense is there. It's just, it gives me a little bit of heartburn that I'm not quite sure how it marries up, like you say, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Anybody else on page 5? I know we're gonna suspend here at in 7 minutes at 5:30. Yes, sir.
Is there a reason that we just allowed the Attorney General to take civil action against the governing boards versus the parents or?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, we believe that the parents already have that ability to do that. They in fact, I think they're doing it today in several cases. But the goal is to have something bigger and more broad to really go after and say, hey, there's big teeth here, and if we see you doing this, you're going to be held to the highest level. But today, there's nothing that, in my understanding, would prohibit the parents from doing that today.
I would. Okay, and that makes sense. Would you be opposed to spelling it out? I mean, I'm thinking from a defense. Well, you can't bring this because it's not enumerated. The legislature enumerated the Attorney General is allowed to do this, so you're not allowed to bring this claim. I'm just being.
No, you bring up a good point. My friends at GTLA gave the thumbs up, so
Okay.
usually they're the first people to make sure I'm on the straight and narrow. So
Good point. Good point.
And they do a great job.
Good.
If I could ask, Mr. Chairman, I've taken some copious notes here.
I think we're in a good place. We've walked through
Right.
very quickly. Could you highlight for us Article 3, kind of how that interacts just briefly with the first part of the bill? We can come back to that perhaps, offline. But the 20-1-30, this Title 20 component, how does that interact with the rest of the bill?
Right. So the purpose of this, I call this the truth in advertising part of the bill. This has the colleges and universities, post-secondary education, put together a public report of all the violations of finding it. So what really has happened in the past is both the organizations and the universities and colleges didn't want to get the bad press and PR. So they swept them under the rug. We've seen that in a lot of different cases over the years. So this is requiring them, right, to publish all this information and to have it out there and available. And an example would be, you know, my 18-year-old wants to rush a fraternity. Well, we can go online and look at that and say, woof, not that one. I mean, they got nothing but problems, right? And really just to make sure, again, I call it truth in advertising.
I will tell you, I like that. I tell you, the thing that gives me pause, and this actually came up in the context of House Bill 138 last night that we voted on in the House, which was disclosing crimes, serious crimes that are occurring in apartment complexes. And on the one hand, I love that because it helps the little guy or gal that are looking for a safe place to live. On the flip side, does it create a perverse incentive if it becomes public to sort of tamp down reporting of that? If an apartment complex owner recognizes, and I think in that context, there's an interest in saying, hey, it incentivizes apartment complex owners to help stamp out crime in their apartments. Otherwise, it gets reported. But there's also this perverse incentive to maybe keep things quiet in this Greek organization setting. Does it create perverse incentives at some level to sort of tamp these things down because there's going to be so much disclosure? I'm friendly to it. I'm just
right. Now you bring up a valid point. In this case, there's been a long-standing problem with this being reported from national organizations, colleges, universities, local organizations across the board, right? They didn't want to have any of the bad press. They didn't want it on the news. They didn't want, it was just for 1,000 good reasons, as we all know, they did not want this to be public. So I think it's actually happening today. This is seeking to shed some light on that.
So in essence, what you would see is XYZ fraternities at University of Georgia, you'd be able to look and see what exactly, because I will confess, I got through end of section 2, which is the criminal provisions. I did not get through in studying today this Article 3 piece. What is your end state? What describe to us what this is going to look like exactly?
Certainly. So as incidents occur, right? All those incidents are put together and published to have a report. Like, in fact, I was just meeting with very briefly before we walked here with Casey Altman with the university system. We'll make a little edit to say online or in print. But I could go in there and I could search all the organizations that are affiliated with the university, and I could learn everything about them, right? This is where they meet. This is what they do here. They're officers. And by the way, here are a list of known problems that they have had. And it just, again, it then gives both the student as well as hopefully the parent who might be involved in those decisions or at least some coaching and mentoring.
So it would say, I'm not going to name any names. But
call it the band, right? The band. It could be one of those.
The band. Leadership, names of leaders, and it's going to say charges, convictions, administrative actions. Is it going to be
Right.
a sexual battery, public drunkenness, aggravated battery? Is all that going to be listed under the?
Yeah, so if you look down, it's on actually page 8. It's going to say the date and the school organization was charged with misconduct, right? The dates that happened, if there was an investigation, the description of what happened, the findings, et cetera. The day it ended, what violation occurred, because it could just say that they were reported, but nothing happened. But if they're reported 20 times and nothing ever comes through, where there's smoke, there's usually going to be fire. But again, that would give both the student and or perhaps the parent, mentor, or whoever, guardian, a chance to look through that and see. I would then trust that person's review of that to know what they were smelling.
I love the end game. I just want to make sure kids aren't thinking to themselves, "Oh my gosh, this gets reported. We've been we've been looked at closely. We're under scrutiny now. We're going to lose the fraternity house if this thing gets out." And is that going to create an incentive to kind of go underground? Much like, for example, illegals don't report things against people who are in this country illegally, because there's this sense of, oh my gosh, we're all going to get found out. So
Sure.
It's a fair question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mr.
I love this part of the bill. I think that I recall from my college days that fraternities and sororities, they were sometimes on probationary periods for whatever reason. So I think there's already some type of reporting mechanism for those entities, and this is I like this this the way you've got this set up, Senator Albers.
Some of us that are a little bit older remember Double Secret Probation too. So remember that from an old movie. So
So anyone that's tuning in online want to add to our hearing Senator Albers' bill? Anybody online?
Chairman Setzler, this is Maisie Lynn Causey from Gactyl.
Welcome.
How are you? Thanks for
Welcome,
hearing
Ms.
from us. We've been listening today. You all have raised many of the concerns we have about this legislation, so I don't feel any need to reiterate your own points to you. The only area that you really haven't discussed that we have some concern about is the age of the folks involved here, and also the interplay this would have with House Bill 272, the Raise the Age bill. I appreciate very much the amendment that Senator Jackson made on the floor, but in doing that, it does impact Raise the Age. So that's one concern that we would just want to bring to the committee's attention. And this idea that the bill does seem to account for poor brain development in the sense that it won't allow express consent to offer a defense, but that the fact that most of the people who are going to be charged in this situation are going to be between the ages of 17 and 25, which is exactly the time period where brain development science is targeted and shows us how the executive functioning is not working properly, gives us pause that these children and young adults are going to be subject to felony punishment in these scenarios. We would appreciate the opportunity to work with whomever is going to be at the table to address some of the concerns that you've raised today, to the extent that we can be helpful with that. As you mentioned, we have concerns about that element of force language. There's the notion of kind of what does prolonged exposure, now I've lost the phrase, prolonged observation, some of the vague terms that are there that cause us some consternation. But we would prefer to have time to speak to the next version of the bill rather than taking up your time today. I know the hour is late.
Well, Ms. Causey, I'd ask you to sort of engage as you do, help flesh some of these things out with the author, because again, there's policy questions here, and there's also issues of good draftsmanship and clarity. And I know particularly as you're looking at multi-state efforts to draft bills where other states might have done things, sometimes you bring language in that might mean certain things in Louisiana that might not have the same meaning or might be not used in Georgia stylistically. Serious bodily injury, Ms. Causey, is that a term? Aren't there references we can bring in?
There are several references. Actually, I think it ends up being serious bodily harm. We do have bodily injury. There are several terms that are available in the code. I don't think that those three string together precisely, but I do know that there's serious bodily harm.
Okay.
That's defined.
Okay. And then lastly, what would your thoughts be with respect to this issue of consent that we raised? I mean, how would you view that issue in the context of Senate Bill 85? What Senate Bill 85 is trying to do?
Well, we don't like the idea that people aren't allowed to consent, especially when you get, like you said earlier today, Chairman, above the age of 18, this idea that any kind of express consent is not a defense. It's troubling. I'm not sure exactly what the scalpel response is to it, but we'd be delighted to have some conversation around it. But like I said before, it does though. I mean, I guess in some ways I'm sort of talking on both sides of the issue to say this, but it also, the idea that these young adults with inadequate brain development can't consent or shouldn't be able to consent is a concept that we actually kind of like on the one hand, because it does acknowledge that lack of judgment having been developed. At the same time, under the law right now, we expect 18 and older to be able to consent. So it's a little bit of a catch-22. I'm not sure what the exact, the best response is, but we would be happy to have more conversation about finding a way to adjust the contours of that language so that it's more appealing to the stakeholders involved.
If I had to predict, I don't think this legislature is going to move in the direction of, unless you're over the age of 25, you as a male, you're somehow less criminally culpable. I don't see this legislature addressing that issue. So we'll consider that off the table for discussion. But
I understand that. I understand, sir. I understand.
But I do think this issue, we're trying to wrestle with this, and ultimately, it's the chair's position. We need to land somewhere. I don't think we can sort of send the bill off to do its thing and close our eyes and hope it works. We've got to know what we're doing with it. And I'm not suggesting that was done. I just think as we work through this, I think we've got to, there may be some policy differences, but I think we have to be clear on what we're doing. We have to have a clear understanding of what's coming as a result. So with that, Ms. Causey, anything else for us?
No, sir. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us. And with that, we're going to suspend consideration. Senator, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
As you can see, this is a much better setting for this than having a family sitting here
Yes.
testifying to the bill. So let's do some homework on it. I'm going to ask Representative McLaurin to lean in on some of these things.
Please.
And we'll have something, hopefully we can work with this committee that a lot of these questions will be answered.
So from a process perspective, would it make sense if I looped in legislative counsel, gave them some of the notes I had, maybe looped us all in an email so we could all just, this way, if I miss something and if Representative McLaurin says, well, actually use this language. Yeah, I'm completely open to your all's wisdom and input. I will tell you that you have much more experience in this area candidly than I do. So,
well, I would say this, the chairs charged, big chairs charge little chair to work through these things. Certainly, Chairman Burchett can speak to some concerns he's got. The approach I would take typically is myself. I'm going to ask Representative McLaurin, who's a stalwart of our subcommittee. If you can work with he and I on some of these things, there may be some policy questions you're not comfortable with that they're suggested, but in terms of ferreting these issues out and getting to a place that we can get common consensus, I think it's very helpful. So I would ask him to help, if you can work with myself and Representative McLaurin on some of these things,
perfect.
Try to get to consensus.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a great night, guys.
Senator Robertson, I hope you've been productive while we've been productive. And I've got, the chair's got a hard break at, call it 5 minutes till, so it maybe 6, but I'd like to be done. If you could highlight your bill to us, Senator, walk through the different provisions. Again, this is the reason we called the hearing today on short notice, is to jump into these things, get our subcommittee's mind around it, and then if there's any other issues, we can perhaps act on it in the next subcommittee here.
Is this chair okay here?
It's all you, sir, whichever one you prefer.
Thank
Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do appreciate the actions of the committee to give me an opportunity to basically discuss the bones of this this piece of legislation that I do think is important in a way, not only to public safety, but also to the manufacturers and to the merchants who are supporting this along with me. But I'm reading off LC 413018S, SCS in brackets. And very simply, going through this, what we are attempting to do is take those substances that contain dextromorphin, also known as DXM, and we're establishing a process in which when an individual goes into the grocery store or goes into their local drugstore and purchases this product, that they would be required under Georgia law to provide some type of legal identification that would show them as 18 years or older in order to purchase these types of over-the-counter medications. Now, in years past, this type of ingredient, this medication, this dextromorphin, has been placed in many, many products. Many of those products are no longer available, so there's a limited amount. And but what we have discovered is that there is substantial abuse from those under the age of 18. So going into the store with the proper ID, they would be able to purchase the medication that they were attempting to buy. And if for some reason a minor, someone 17 years or younger, based on this legislation, were to attempt to do that, then the minor would subject themselves for a first offense. They would make contact with law enforcement, and they would receive a letter stating and advising them that they had violated Georgia law, and it would explain the law to them. Same thing with a clerk who purposely or inadvertently sold the product to someone underage. They would also receive the same treatment as the minor. On a second violation, then they would be charged with a misdemeanor under Georgia law. And when we first put the bill out, that was pretty much the primary issues within the bill. But then later, after speaking with some of those that sell the medication wholesale and those that provide it retail, because of the pandemic and the evolution of shopping during the pandemic, we discussed that there would be opportunities possibly for someone through Instacart or some other type of app to attempt to purchase the drug through one of those types of platforms. And so we went in and amended the original legislation and added in what you see between line 30 and line 36 on page 2 to deal with that. The primary purpose that this legislation was brought forward is that there has been an increased amount of dextromorphin abuse by young people who use it to create concoctions in the past known as purple drink, lean, and some of these other concoctions. And during the judicial hearing over on the Senate side, it was pointed out by Senator Harold Jones that it's some of these things that have really devastated some of the urban populations of youth in cities like Chicago and others, where while law enforcement is focusing on those illicit street drugs that we're all aware of, that the creative minds and underdeveloped minds, like it was pointed out in earlier testimony on the previous legislation, come up with these ideas of mixing chemicals to create some kind of concoction that they can get some kind of what they consider happiness but euphoric feeling from, after seeing those of us above the age of the legal age of being able to purchase alcohol and other things to try to achieve that same thing. So I do have evidence of abuse, evidence of psychological addiction, claims of physical addiction, and I do have evidence of suicides related to young people who became addicted on this. And as we know, that first euphoric feeling is the same feeling that we attempt to capture over and over again, whether it's our love of black coffee, which is my addiction, or whether it's alcohol or cigarettes or anything else. And children in these early development stages, these things right here, they have the exact same experiences. But the purpose of this legislation is very narrow, I feel, and is only focused on these finished products that contain dextromorphin, where we're asking them to do the same thing we ask every individual who goes into Tractor Supply or other places to buy glue. We're just asking them to show their identification and for the clerk to check it. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, sir. Chair recognizes Representative McLaurin for a question.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Good to see you, Senator.
It's always good to see you, my friend.
Always, friend. And I want to go ahead and mark another dramatic flip-flop on criminal penalties for children for the record for the committee here for me. I've got a couple concerns, I think mainly related to, first, the agency that Georgia law already affords to children between the ages of 14 and 17 and so many other aspects of life regarding their independence and responsibility and their ability to partake in legal privileges that are either limited or available to adults. The second category of concern I have is the usefulness or lack thereof of a criminal penalty for a minor purchasing DXM as the enforcement mechanism, or one of the enforcement mechanisms for the statute. So the first set of things is basically just, kind of a broad policy observation that, we let, in some cases, I'm understanding 14 and 15-year-olds drive with limited permits, depending on, the condition of their parents. Certainly 15, 16-year-olds under certain circumstances can drive to the pharmacy if their parents cannot, in order to obtain medication on behalf of the family, for example. There's so many other legal rights that minors under the age of 18 have, the ability to have a will. I mean, you could make a long list. And so there is a policy question for the committee, obviously, about the harmfulness of DXM and how, weighing the most common uses. I mean, maybe even numbers could be helpful in terms of, is the average person under 18 who's going to buy it, are we talking that 80% of those people are using it for an illicit purpose? Is it 40%? Is it 10%? And I don't know that there's any way that we would know that. But that is the first broad area of concern I have. And I want to state for the record, I had heard of both Purple Drink and Lean before these hearings. And so I feel I feel plugged in at least enough, or qualified enough to understand that, this is an idea that is somewhat pervasive in the culture, enough for me to have heard of these things. But I guess it's a weighing the rights issue. And then the second thing, and we can go in any order the chair would like, but, we're already in a posture where there potentially could be a reclassification of these drugs to be behind the counter. It's possible, right? It's possible for a misdemeanor liability to attach to the provider, whether it's a retail clerk or pharmacist, or whoever might be in the building who's providing it to a minor. And I understand that warning letters are in place for first offense in both cases. But I guess the question I'm left with is, I don't see where misdemeanor criminal liability on a minor does anything to further the enforcement priority of this bill, right, or the goal of the bill, that a civil penalty would not accomplish. And if somebody says to me, well, could you get a $250 fine from a minor? I guess my response would be, well, does attaching misdemeanor liability to that same minor, make the difference? I don't know that it does. And I think, in law school, we study this idea of least cost avoider, that if government's going to regulate something, the entity it should regulate is the entity that has the greatest ability to solve the harm most efficiently. Because if you regulate that entity, that will cause that entity to do the, least cost solution on behalf of society. And in this case, I don't think it's the minor. I think it's the store that's going to sell these things should have the primary responsibility and be the primary object of regulation. And anything on top of that, I'm just concerned about diminishing returns. So and it's long-winded, but those are the two concerns in full that I have. And if you want to address them, happy to hear.
Well, and if you don't mind, I'll address number 2 first. Is I do agree with you, and in one part I do agree is when this legislation first came across last year, it did have a civil penalty in it, and so and we removed the civil penalty just because of the concerns that came with what you said. Is monetary punishment is what I have found through my career sometimes is the least productive type of punishment, where in a misdemeanor, a misdemeanor does not involve incarceration. In many cases, it does not involve fines. It can involve some types of sanctions. And when we start talking about juvenile, in the greater scheme of things, if a 17 or younger individual knowingly went into the local grocery store or the drugstore and to purchase this stuff for the reason of abusing it, then obviously there are issues beyond the criminal justice system that should be addressed. And I think that having it in the way of a misdemeanor opens up the system a little more for the system to assist with that, whether it's to push an individual towards some type of positive counseling, whether it's engaging with their parents if they're available, and try to address the situation in a way to where in some of these cases, especially if you look in some of the urban settings, paying fines and things of that nature would be cost prohibitive to begin with. And so that was the reason we made the shift from the civil punishment over to the the criminal punishment.
And quickly on that, I mean, my understanding is that the model code for this and what most other states have done is a civil punishment. Do you know of any other states that have done misdemeanor liability?
I know that the few pieces that I've looked at, there were, I think out of the three I saw, two were civil and one was a misdemeanor. And
Okay.
I'll try to get that information.
Okay.
But I mean, in a perfect world, to be honest with you, I don't think it's not going to take many of these types of interactions in most communities to educate those who would think about offending to realize that it would not be fruitful for them to go out and attempt to purchase the stuff. News travels fast within these small communities where children find some type of substance to abuse and try to abuse it, much like glue in my elderly age back in the 70s and late 60s when people were going and buying airplane glue and using it to abuse themselves.
Well, and to be clear, my objection to misdemeanor liability in this case is not just some sort of like
Right.
libertarian, I don't want any, it's really about efficiency and about solving the problem, which is,
Right.
I'm asking, what does it add? Because we're already, this bill would put a misdemeanor on the seller. And there's going to be, I trust Walgreens and CVS to handle this problem with that kind of a penalty attached way more than the average minor, both understand the nature of the penalty, go through, even a juvie justice system and try to find some sort of positive resolution by getting caught up. So I guess my point is, I don't know that the misdemeanor is worth the additional amount of enforcement oomph that it provides when we're already trying to focus the regulation primarily on the people who have access to and are selling the DMX
Right.
or the DXM.
Let me suggest this, and this is, to the gentleman's question, they're all well taken, and the author's intention as well. I always want to, when I think about these, look to the existing code. Where's there a structure in existing code that's doing the same thing that we can sort of tap into, rather than creating, there's a lot of words on this page, and when we do that, there's a lot of opportunities for error. In 2019, this committee acted and passed House Bill 551 dealing with kratom. In fact, it's Title 16, Chapter 13, Article 6 on kratom, and it's really the same structure. It's a very, very, very short article. It has a definition of kratom, and then the operative part says simply this: no person shall sell or transfer possession of kratom to another person under 18 years of age, nor shall any person under 18 years of age possess kratom. Person who's convicted of violating code section shall be guilty of a misdemeanor. Period. That's it. And all the fullness of that fleshes out. The next code section talks about labeling requirements that if you're selling something, you've got to say that it's got this in it and what the percentage is. If you considered that approach to take essentially that same framework and apply it to this just in a very simple way.
And Chair, I think I really appreciate that. I like that. I think this does do that in the way it's laid out, but to add it to something else might possibly be the solution that we're looking for. As far as, like you said, I find no joy in creating new law.
Yeah.
And so anywhere where we can integrate what we're trying to do here with something else. Now, in the under the subject of kratom, if I had my way, kratom would not be available in Georgia. I think it's an extremely dangerous substance, natural substance, and I think it's abused way beyond this and other things. But I have no concern at all looking into that and seeing if there's a possibility to merge something.
Because I say that it's not to say kratom but
you're looking at the format. I agree.
But as you think about that, there's a structure for this. In essence, things that we're saying is illegal to sell to people under the age of 18. It's illegal to possess if you're under age of 18. And then on the required label, there's a labeling requirement, which is really going to be my question in this is to make sure if we're going to do this, and this is a trace substance in some over the counter drugs, to make sure there's clarity. Can I sell this? Can I not? I mean, you shouldn't have to turn it around and look at the 1.5 font text on there to see if it's present. you know,
Right.
to do that. And we've done that with Kratom. I don't want to create chaos across our pharmacies. I don't
Right.
know. Do you have any idea, or perhaps even, I'm not going to put the lady on the spot. Do you know how many substances in a pharmacy would have this in it in a way that you'd be looking to address?
I've got a list of brand names of combination products, but which is voluminous, but the vast majority of these products are either no longer sold or items that are basically inventory type items. It's a very, very
Oh,
small
it's all one.
group.
Because you know, we wrestled with it
Yeah.
with a not dissimilar thing about 7 years ago when we dealt with the Sudafed,
Correct.
which was sold over the counter, but we wanted to control it. We're not contemplating blister packs as being limited to how you'd sell this, but I think the Kratom structure seems to address all the issues you're seeing. And again, I don't want to, I'm not shooting your bill apart.
No,
I'm
sir.
just saying, if there could be some simplicity, if there's a set of substances that we're not going to sell under the age of 18, it's illegal to sell and illegal to possess. I think the civil liability, if you're committing a misdemeanor by selling it, there's a civil right of action of both law enforcement or potentially parents that
Correct.
could be brought. That exists if there's a misdemeanor. I don't think we're overshooting, but again, it's a policy question. But I think structurally it would be an easy way to do this if, Chair recognizes Chairman Cooper. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So actually, I'm glad you brought up Kratom because, to the senator's point, much more dangerous substance, right? And I think I'm going to not be able to quote you exactly just a minute ago, but you said abused way more often.
Right. By everyone, adults, those that
Right.
can buy it. Correct.
Right.
Like alcohol.
Right.
Absolutely.
And I think we made a judgment about Kratom that it's inherently dangerous to an extent, at least, that's beyond DXM, which we use to treat, cold flu symptoms, I guess. Right.
FDA approved. Yeah.
Exactly. So to me, that's actually very relevant information because what we did in that House bill, Mr. Chair, is we made it a misdemeanor to possess it. Right. Whereas here, for a minor and here, I think that suggests to me that it's a little disproportionate to have the same criminal punishment for a minor in possession of DXM. Now, could I get behind the idea of, again, to my point, regulating the provider, the seller, as a choke point to make sure that the minors don't get it? That I could more get behind. I think my concern is, to do this for DXM, we'd be putting it on the same level as this sort of like inherently dangerous, abused more often style drug.
And if you don't mind, to my concern on there is not comparing DXM to Kratom. It's comparing the danger of any of these substances that are abused by minors to the impact on minors, where we talked about the brain development and other types of issues that these, and if not to insult anybody, but I mean, as I once was 17, children are inherently reckless, and children tend to mimic the behavior that they see in adults. And so the balance, I think, comes between whether it's Kratom, whether it's Spice, whether it's DXM. We look at all of them equal. It's not necessarily the abuse we see when adults get it, who can go out and purchase it every day and overuse it and overabuse it. My goal here, as overused as this statement is in this building, is to protect the young people from becoming a victim of these types of substances.
She's going to recognize Chairman Cooper.
Okay, well, Senator Robinson has really hit home the point, is that what it does to a young person's forming brain. And so it's just as dangerous because of the damage it does to a young brain and a developing person as when adults do it. So I see it as being on the same level.
And to your point, Chairwoman, we have the same restrictions on purchasing alcohol. And I don't think anybody here would disagree with the fact that it is the most abused and most dangerous drug available. And it's a misdemeanor for a minor to attempt to purchase, and it is a misdemeanor for a merchant to sell, to knowingly sell, especially in most of those cases.
Chairman? and here again, to your point, if you want to do that, I don't see, I'd have to go back to the studies, but I'm not sure that alcohol is as dangerous to a developing brain, certainly not good, and they shouldn't have it, as the substance that we're trying to work on, taking care of now.
So
I may be wrong. I'd have to go back to
And
studies, but I
I
think I'm
think per
right.
volume, you're correct, because it takes a little more of this to get the euphoric feeling than it would alcohol.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Chair's going to recognize Representative McLaurin for one more remark, and I would say this. I'm really kind of dividing the question. I'm not even speaking to the policy question of misdemeanor responsibility for seller or possession. The policy question exists. I'm just saying structurally, this is a whole new framework that I think could be simplified. And then the Kratom's, because we even wrestled with Kratom a couple of years ago. I think
Yes,
it took 2 or 3 years to pass a bill just because
We were
there
here.
wasn't how do you write a Kratom statute? And it was we landed on something very simple in Article 6 of 1613. So that may be a place structurally this could live. But again, there is going to be the question about the misdemeanor or otherwise. So that will be a policy question for every member of the committee.
And Mr. Chair, did you say that was 16-13-6?
It's
is the Kratom
1613, which is dangerous substances,
sir.
and it's Article 6.
Article 6?
It's a very simple structure the way that's framed.
And I'll look at that. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Representative McLaurin, then Chair Cooper is going to have the final word.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think this discussion has added a lot of clarity on what really the question should be here. And to try to be a straight shooter, I mean, if it's actually true that this medicine, pound for pound, is as dangerous as alcohol or kratom, I mean, those are things that I think we have made a policy judgment are inherently dangerous for minors. Not just dangerous in some cases, but inherently dangerous, which is why we have a criminal prohibition across the board. I mean, it's cold medicine, and listen, I don't know the science as well as y'all do, but if it's, if there's science that suggests that these things are actually on an equal playing field, I can understand that prohibition. But my understanding is this is for this drug specifically, it's not in line with model codes to do a misdemeanor. And we've been, we have a policy judgment that even though it's strong medicine, that it's fine, that minors can use it and that there's a way to use it without abusing it. I think it's the policy right now, the state of Georgia, that there's not a way for a minor to use alcohol without abusing it. And so to me, that's a very material distinction I think we should keep in mind.
And that was to my point where I was saying, and use the term pound for pound, where I was saying that these aren't like that. I said, it would take much less alcohol for a child to reach the euphoric state that as opposed to this. And that's where the level of abuse is they're not purchasing this and using a tablespoon to get intoxicated. They're using the entire bottle to get intoxicated. And so in there is what we've seen happen. So they're going back and buying more and continuing to abuse it.
This is Chairman Cooper.
Okay, I apologize. I have another meeting and I was going to ask if this is going to be tabled until it can be changed, if I might be excused.
Madam, this is a hearing only today, Madam Chair.
Oh,
Yes,
okay. I didn't get that. All right, then I'm going to excuse myself.
And to the chairman's question, that this is first day after crossover. We want to hear you right up front, so we got time to work these things.
Mhm.
Appreciate your time. We had no intention of acting on it, but again, we've got the policy question, we've got the structural question I asked. So let's again work with the chair.
And this is a great committee. I mean, friends from corner to corner, and I appreciate that. I think we're all up here for the same reason, and I appreciate the advice, and I'll dive into it and have answers when I come back.
Appreciate you.
Thank
And,
you, Mr.
with that, we stand adjourned.